In this video I'm going to talk about genetics and genetic modification. I'm going to explain what genetics is and what genetic modification is, how it is being applied already in humans, in healthcare, etc. And we're going to look into the future. What are possible future applications and also use cases of genetics and genetic modification. Let me start with a story. I was about 16 years old and I was at my house and my brother was also there, and it was in the northern part of the Netherlands. And it was strange because my parents were not at home. And outside I could hear the wind blowing and some sounds from agricultural machines, because we lived in the farmlands. And outside it was also a little bit cold. And suddenly a car stops and my parents walk out and I could see there's something wrong. Father, what's happening? Sorry to bring you this, Peter, but your grandfather, did you remember that he had some pain on the chest? Yeah. Well, he was a strong man, but also very stubborn, because he thought, well, what's the problem? So when we found out, we directly went to the general practitioner and he sent your grandfather to the hospital where he passed away a couple of hours ago. Wow. That had such an impact on me, and kind of forgot about that incident. Of course, I think about my grandfather sometimes, but after when I was about 28 years old, I spit in a tube and I sent it to a company. And a couple of weeks later, I got an email that says, Peter, your genome has been sequenced, or at least a part of it. And there it was a gene, RS1928843, for example, that says I had a higher incidence or risk of also having a heart attack or some defects in my artery system or my heart. And that's when I realized the power of genetics, because you get half of your DNA from your father and half of your DNA from your mother, and they get it from their fathers and mothers. So these risk of having something with my heart, it's in my family. And that was the moment that I was really interested in what could I learn from my genes, so that's genetics, but also are we sometime in the future able to change our genetics, and that's genetic modification. So what is genetics? You could look at genetics as the building blocks of life. And for we as humans, there are almost 3.2 billion base pairs, ACTG, in almost every cell of your body. And they contain information, they're molecules with information. And via ribosomes, it's called the central dogma of the microbiology, it will form into amino acids which will form proteins, and they contain all kinds of functions in your body. For example, hormones, neurotransmitters, but also making of tissue and organs, etc. So genetic information is like the instruction manual for your body. And these 3.2 billion base pairs, they contain letters, but not every sequence of letters is a gene. A gene is a sequence of letters that codes for a certain amino acid and forms into a protein. And we have about 25,000 genes contained on 23 chromosomes. And in 2003 was a major event, because then the so-called Book of Life was finished, which was a genome sequence of the human body. And that made the news because then President Bill Clinton and Tony Blair of the UK, they made a statement and a press moment out of it. Now we have deciphered the Book of Life. So that's genetics. So, but it's also in ourselves as a species that at the moment we can analyze things, we also want to change and maybe alter it. And that's called genetic modification. And genetic modification is not that strange, because we are doing it for ages with mixing of crops, but also breeding animals. But we also tried to do it on our DNA for years now, with X-rays or chemicals. Some other technologies were zinc fingers or talen. But one of the most promising technologies of the last years is CRISPR-Cas9, which was kind of invented by a whole host of researchers, but Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier really made the headlines with it, with their publication. What's interesting about this technology is that it's an ancient-old way in which bacteria can fight off viruses. And somehow Doudna and Charpentier found out that they could program that. So we can use it for all kinds of forms in animals, plants, but also in humans. Because what are possible applications in humans? For example, I told you about my grandfather who had some problems with his heart. My grandmother from the same side, she suffered from Alzheimer's, dementia at a later age. So could it also be in my genes, and is there a way I could somehow cut and paste it out of my genome? Well, it's not that far, but George Church is one of the renowned genetics experts, I should say, and he came up with a list with what are the most beneficial genes at the moment. And these genes are LRP5 for stronger bones, MSTN for larger muscles, lower sensitivity to pain, memory improvement, or what's also very handy, a gene that you can modify so you can hold your breath for longer than just a few seconds. That was just a demonstration. So it's interesting that we already see some beneficial genes, and later in this video I'm going to talk about what will happen if people decide to alter and change them to upgrade themselves. I want to give you a couple of examples. The first one is where it's been used in healthcare, and already healthcare professionals say we cannot see a future in which genetic modification does not play a role in healthcare. And it's already been used a lot. CRISPR-Cas9 is still in 2020 doing in experiments, but some examples are patients with leukemia, where the blood is taken out of the patients and then the blood is being genetically modified, especially the T cells, and then the blood is put back into the patient. Another example is a certain eye disease where researchers could very precisely go to the cells they need to modify at the back of the eye and modify them so people can restore part of their eyesight. And these examples also show the difficulty with genetic modification, because how do you get the right modification at the right cell? Because you cannot just swap a pill and then see if it gets directly at your brain cells or, I don't know, at your muscle cells, etc. But in the case of leukemia and the eye, that are examples because you can be very precise where you want that modification to take place. So that's healthcare. A famous example concerning genetic modification is the modification of embryos. So selection of embryos is already been done. You can think of in vitro fertilization, where you cannot conceive children in a natural way. But what really made the headlines in 2018 was that 2 Chinese babies were born, Lulu and Nana. And Lulu and Nana, they were, should I say, helped by a scientist, Jianku He. And he was very proud and he made a YouTube video about what he did. And I'm going to show that video right now.
2 beautiful little Chinese girls named Lulu and Nana came crying into the world as healthy as any other babies a few weeks ago. The girls are home now with their mom Grace and dad Mark. Grace started her pregnancy by regular IVF, with one difference. Right after we sent her husband's sperm into her egg, we also sent in a little bit of protein and instruction for a gene surgery. When Lulu and Nana was just a single cell. This surgery removed the doorway through which HIV entered to infect people.
So after Mr. He published his video, there was a lot of outbreak by ethicists, by colleague scientists, by politicians, by the media, that it was absolutely crazy and not allowed to tinker with the genetics of embryos. And at the moment, 2020, he's also in prison in China for doing this experiment. But what's interesting is, from a larger perspective, is that Lulu and Nana, as we know right now, are the first human beings which were genetically altered. And that also led, for example, people to say we are maybe on the brink of getting from Homo sapiens to Homo sapiens genetics, or Homo sapiens to Homo Deus, like the book of Yuval Noah Harari. And what's interesting also is there was some speculation about he changed the CCR5 gene, at least that worked at one of the two embryos, but it also could lead to an increase of intelligence. That's at least a rumor. So I will get into that aspect later, but it's interesting to see what are kind of applications and further developments. But let's say it clear. As I'm aware, it was very disputable what Mr. He did, because it was not proven, it was not safe. There was some questions about if the parents did give their consent for the operation, as you might call it. And of course, what about the children themselves? They were not able to give their opinion or consent of the operation. But I must say, one of the benefits of genetic modification in embryos, let's say theoretically, is like at the moment I want to change my genes, I have to change them, let's say, in every cell of my body. But the benefit you have by genetic modification of embryos is when you modify them at that stage, after that, these cells, they divide and they multiply. So if you make like one alteration, it will continue on in other cells. So that's a theoretical advantage of genetic modification in embryos. But there are people that like to do genetic modification on the cells when they're grown up. Let's give you 3 examples. The first one is Elizabeth Paris. She's the CEO of BioViva. And she claims that that genetic modification helped her to lengthen her telomeres, which leads her to an increased lifespan. So that's an interesting. It's not been tested or verified by other scientists, but it's an interesting idea. Another one is Tristan Roberts. I also interviewed Tristan for my YouTube channel, and Tristan suffers from HIV. And he read about a paper in which scientists claimed that there are certain people who have a genetic predisposition to make their own antibodies against the HIV virus. So he tried with genetic modifying him in the fat cells in his belly, so that these cells would also change and therefore his own body will make the antibodies. Sadly, it did not work out, but it also made a lot of media coverage and was also featured in the documentary on Netflix called Unnatural Selection. The last example is Josiah Zehner, and he's also the CEO of the Odin. And he, as a kind of stunt, did genetic modification on himself to increase his muscles, because there's myostatin, which is a certain process in the cells which inhibits muscle growth, and he injected himself with the idea to knock that myostatin out. But it didn't work. But I show you a short clip of what kind of ideas he has for humans genetically modifying themselves. It's with a Dutch subtitle, so if you're Dutch, you're lucky, but he tells in English, so I think that's okay.
My dream is that it becomes like more open, people become more open to human beings changing their own genetics as adults or as children, change the way we think about being human. Instead of just everybody being born with the genetics they have for their whole life, maybe we can start changing that up. And for interesting and fun stuff, you know, everything doesn't have to be, everybody, you know, cure this disease, cure that disease, you know? It's like, you know, we get tattoos and stuff like that. Why can't we, you know, grow a tail or grow wings or, you know?
So what does the future hold? I think we will know more and more, also with the use of other technologies like artificial intelligence, about what is the function of certain genes on the body. Of course, there's also a lot we still do not know, like for example, the so-called junk DNA or dark DNA, which do not code for certain amino acids, and also the role of the microbiome or the virome, etc. But still, with more and more people sequencing their DNA and with artificial intelligence, we will know more about the genetics. And probably it will also lead to more people, possibly if it's also the science is progressing and maybe we have other technologies that are even better than CRISPR-Cas9, that possibly people are also willing to do it on themselves. Especially people like Tristan Roberts that have a certain disease and that are willing to see themselves as a human guinea pig, maybe also if they're desperate, and they are willing to step out of the line or cross that border to genetically modify themselves. I'm not sure if like the genetic modification of embryos will become a big trend, because like I told you, you have to maybe it's better to select the certain embryo who does not carry a disease instead of changing the embryo genetically. But still, of course, we're not sure how these things are going to play out in the future. But it would be interesting to see a merger of these developments. Like, do we know if certain genes code for intelligence or muscle power or athletic performance? And are people then also willing to try it on themselves or at their embryos? So interesting times ahead concerning genetic modification. So I talked about genetics, genetic modification. I talked about some applications of genetic modification at yourself, at embryos, currently in healthcare. And I gave you a small perspective into the future. Thank you for watching, and I will see you at the next video. Please subscribe to my channel, and also if you have a question or a remark, leave a comment down below. Go to my website if you want to have a free download, and if you're interested in more in-depth knowledge and know-how about human enhancement, human augmentation, biohacking and the superhuman era.